Welcome to Underdubs, a podcast about 70s progressive rock and more. This podcast is a conversational music variety show with a focus on the classic progressive rock artists of the 1970s and how their music has shaped culture, technology, and the music of today. We'll, of course, cover the classic prog bands like Yes and Genesis, but also other forms like the Canterbury scene, neo-prog, proto-prog, and fusion, and all points in between. Your hosts, Brian Donahue and Pat Strawser, are two of the founding members of the instrumental progressive rock fusion band Volaré, based in Athens, Georgia, from the mid-1990s. In this first episode of Underdubs, we introduce ourselves and talk about why we're doing this show and what we plan on talking about. We also talk about our band Volaré. We cover our beginnings, our history, and our musical influences. And we discuss the Canterbury progressive rock scene and its influence on Volaré. Be sure to check out the links that we provide in the notes for playlists and other content that we discuss here. We hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to Underdubs, 70s progressive rock and more. We're going to talk about progressive rock and all points in between.
And you may be wondering, who are these guys and how do they know each other?
Who are they?
So I'm Brian, that's Pat.
Hi.
And we played music together back when we were very young and handsome. Long time ago, mid-90s, early to mid-90s.
That's right.
And we were in an instrumental band called Volaré. This was in Athens, Georgia, USA, where we grew up. And since then, we've remained friends, and we're both still big progressive rock fans. And we thought, wouldn't it be fun to do a podcast and talk about stuff? And that's what we're doing.
That's it. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. When did we meet? 1994, right? That's when we started.
I definitely joined the band in 94. I can't remember if I spoke to you at the end of 93. I responded to an ad, one of the old-fashioned ads with the little tear-off phone numbers at the bottom.
That's right.
And it seems like I spoke to you before or around Christmas break of 93, because you and Steve Hatch, the guitar player, were both college students, and I was not. But it was definitely early 94 when we started to get together and started playing a little bit, and then realized, there is something here. We have like-minded people. We have very similar record collections, which is pretty unusual to be. How old were you then? 20, 21?
Not even. This is 1993 and 94. 93, I was 18.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So I turned 19 in 1994, June of 94. So, there it is. Yeah. So at that stage, I think the ad read something like, if you like bands like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Jethro Tull, and Rush, something along those lines, then give me a call. And that's when I heard from Steve and then you in very short order, and off we went. Right. So. Yeah.
So, and we ended up as a 4-piece or as a 5-piece band. Volaré continued from that point up until summer of 1997, and we recorded I almost said demo, an EP, a cassette EP, which turned out really well. And then we got the Laser's Edge record label to put out a CD for us in 1997 of all new recordings, new compositions, new recordings, called The Uncertainty Principle. And then the band, that was the end of the band. But then a few years later, a friend of ours put out another CD called Memoirs, which grabbed the old cassette EP material and some other stuff and put it together in a CD form. So we really had 2 CDs, 1 cassette. We did a lot in that time span. It's funny to look back, and nowadays we're used to things taking 5 years between phone calls or whatever, or work considerations that take 5 or 6 years to unfold. but we did a lot to be 20 something years, 21 years old, 22 years old.
Yeah.
We got a lot done.
We did. It was, especially being, effectively the first band I'd ever been in. And I would say that certainly the most active band that any of us had been in, first active band.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
So, and I like to use the saying, building the plane in the air when referring to at least my part in things, because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to play the instrument. I'm the keyboard player, and I barely knew what to do. In fact, part of the reason I put out the call for musicians that would have been late fall of 1993 was because I had some other friends of mine that were really, really good. A couple of guys that I went to high school with, and some other guys from the neighboring area, like in Atlanta and a small town north of here called Toccoa. And these guys were going to put together a progressive rock cover band with set lists. The set list included things like Inca Roads by Frank Zappa, and Sound Chaser and Tarkus, Steely Dan, The Police. It was a kind of an eclectic list of tunes, but very strongly centered around the classic prog stuff and some of the more difficult stuff I might add. And I was just,
definitely.
I was just like, I can't hang. So I tucked tail and put out the ad, and away we went.
Well, we didn't rely on learning other people's music from the get-go. I mean, we dabbled in a couple covers, nothing seriously, but nothing too strenuous. But from the get-go, we just wanted to write music that we would listen to, and the stuff that we listened to was, I think we both had turntables, so it was easy to scoop up used vinyl in those days because we still had brick and mortar record stores, and they usually had an upstairs room or a basement room with all the records that somebody's uncle donated that nobody wanted to listen to. And it was stuff like Rick Wakeman, Six Wives of Henry VIII. And you remember the Patrick Moraz albums that we found. And we had ELP, big Genesis fans, King Crimson fans, yes, Jethro Tull, all that stuff that you mentioned, and we somehow it worked where the three of us, you, me, and Steve on guitar, got together. Pat on keyboards, me on drums, Steve on guitar, and it took a little while to get something presentable, but once we did, I felt like we were underway, and it wasn't going to stop until it ran its course, just like a virus, and it did, and we got a lot done, and we, I think we definitely, the roots of the music, the progressive rock stuff that we loved, and also the Canterbury stuff that we loved, definitely came through in what we did, and I don't know, I'm really proud of it. I think it turned out great. I can't imagine a first serious band being more fun or more productive. Maybe more successful, but not more fun or productive.
Well, yeah, or creative, quite honestly. I mean, I still look at that period of my life and the output that we had, and still think it's some of the most creative stuff that that I'd ever participated in. And just because it was so unique, I haven't heard anything quite like it in the groups that I've worked with since. And I've stayed in the music biz in one form or another since the folding of the group in 1999, or I guess it was before 99, but since
it's 97, right?
97. Yeah, our last live gig was Prog Day of 1997, and so I continued to do things, and I've been able to do a lot of cool stuff, but nothing that was nothing as interesting as those two records that we did. I mean, they're far from perfect or anything, but they're also they're kind of an interesting time capsule in a way of, musicians of a particular age in one way of looking at it, and also the time period for music in general and for the progressive rock scene in particular, because it would appear that even today, that record, The Uncertainty Principle, still gets some, people still listen to it and they still like it and they still find things to enjoy in it, which I think is, I don't want to, at the risk of sounding a little, a little presumptuous, there's a sort of a timelessness, I think, to that record in a way. Or it would appear to be, just because it still has some listenability all this time later.
Yeah.
So
I think it's bursting with enthusiasm. If nothing else, it's bursting with enthusiasm, because we were firmly in creativity mode, and it was just 24/7. We just wanted to do music as often as we could. But we're talking about the mid 90s. It is safe to say that a Canterbury inspired instrumental 4-piece from the United States, it's not super sellable, right? I mean, it's not like we were going to get tour support from a big record label and go off and tour 350 days a year and make a big career out of it. Maybe had we become more of a jam band, that elements of that would have opened up, but that wasn't really what we were all about. So we did not try to pursue that. We just did our thing, and we kind of knew, I think, that we had a certain amount of time to get it done before careers and school and everything. People move out of town, and that's life. But, we're talking about the mid 90s. So alternative rock had kind of given away to grunge, and, radio was very monolithic and certainly not interested in anything we were going to do. And then, do you remember when the band Ekelin kind of burst forth in 94, 95? And it all of a sudden seemed, oh, well, maybe there is a market for things that are kind of more backward looking. People, records made by people who know who Gentle Giant is, as opposed to records made by, that's the two categories. Records made by people who know who Gentle Giant is, records made by people who do not.
Right.
So it seemed that was 94, 95, right when we were really getting going, that we thought, oh, well, maybe we are, this is the tip of the iceberg. We're at the beginning of the rainbow. Here we go.
Right. Well, I don't know about you. I don't know that my ambitions ever went beyond getting a gig or writing the next new tune or recording or something like that. It was always, my own personal imagination of a flighty musician at the age of 20. I just was having a good time, and I didn't have any, I wanted for nothing. So in a very real way, I could afford for this to be only something that I wanted to do. It didn't need to make money. I didn't need to learn covers. We didn't need to sound like a particular thing so that it would be marketable. It never really entered in my mind that other than when people would say, you guys need a singer.
And we got that a lot. We got that at pretty much every gig. our brand of music, whether we call it progressive rock or for a while we called it garage fusion, which was funny, or whatever you want to call it, instrumental music. It was deeply, deeply unpopular. Can we say that? we're living and playing in a college town famous for its music scene, and we're just kind of skirting around the edge of it. Maybe by 96 or early 97, we'd kind of crash through to some level of acceptance. Like, okay, well, it's these guys and they want a gig. I guess we got to give it to them. But there was never a threat of it really catching fire. You know what I mean? But I'm with you in that the motivation was to do it more. You know, I wanted to get a gig for next month so that we would be able to call a bigger venue 2 months later and say, hey, we played at XYZ and we got 77 people in there. So don't you want to let us play? You know, it was all it's a shell game of trying to climb up the ladder. And when you're 22 or 21 or whatever, it's fun. It was fun.
Well, it was totally fun. And I think also the prevailing, you know, the popular bands of the time, the bands that would have been considered sellable, you know, I don't know, the bands that I think of are things like Hootie and the Blowfish and Dave Matthews Band and these kind of like mid-90s, not exactly grunge bands, but just sort of 90s kind of pop rock type stuff, the Wallflowers and things like that, stuff that would come into town and they would pack out the local venues of the 40 Watt and the Georgia Theater, which we never played, by the way.
That's right, we never did.
Strangely enough, it was a
we played the 40 Watt, but not the
40
Georgia Theater.
Yeah. But the reason I bring
is why it burned down later. Some angry Volaré fans mobbed it and torched it, but they rebuilt it. Don't worry, they rebuilt it.
Right. All's good. But you know, while we were never popular in that sense where we would pack out one of these clubs, there was there's an ethos of artistry, I guess you'd say, in Athens that made us acceptable enough. Like we were cool to some folks, I think, because there were other kind of quirky instrumental bands floating around. Not many, and none.
Depending on how we dressed it up, and depending on how we marketed it, you know. I
remember being compared to a cross between. Let me see if I can get it right. Angelo Badalamenti from the Twin Peaks soundtrack, Bela Fleck, Doctor Who, and Europe. Like the Final Countdown, because it has a synthesizer in it.
Right. I think I remember the one. I mean, the description for people who are not into the prog bands of the 70s was like, oh, it's schizophrenic movie theme song, TV theme song music. You might like them, you might not, but it's crazy fun. And then when you say, oh, by the way, we're into Yes and Genesis and King Crimson, they say, oh, I get it.
Right.
Well, never mind.
Right.
So there's already that stigma, you know, the prog stigma, which it sticks with you.
Right. Well, one thing is for sure is that the prog thing was not cool. Like you said, I mean, you could, you know, to your point, like we could dance around as, so what does your band sound like? Well, we're instrumental. And if you list, you know, Happy the Man, all these, you know, prog bands or whatever, like, there's the vacant stare. But if you say something like, well, we're a little bit like Doctor Who and, you know, that whole thing, then you get a little bit more like, you get a little, oh, well, that sounds interesting. I might swing by on my way to the Squirrel Nut Zippers show.
Exactly.
You know, we didn't stay a garage band. We kind of matured into something else. And I think some of that sound, I don't know, in my mind, there is a, you know, without getting into, you know, it's progressive rock. It's fusion. It's prog. It's fusion.
Kind of a chocolate peanut butter situation.
They go head to head tonight at 11. The idea for the influences that initially sparked the beginning of the group were like the classic prog bands that we've mentioned earlier, Genesis and so forth. But I think that in pretty short order, we discovered some of these other bands that were lesser known, this kind of second tier of prog bands that, if you're a Yes fan, then the Yes family tree, and all the John Anderson solo albums and the Rick Wakeman solo albums and Bruford and all this sort of thing. But then there's a whole other level that if you don't care about it, then you'll probably never know about National Health and Hatfield in the North and the Caravan, family tree and all the rest of it. And I think that was really kind of a pivotal moment when we discovered, I would say, this makes an interesting question for you. What would you say was there a particular band? I have a band in mind that served as a sort of a spinning point or a pivot point for the group where it's like, oh, well, we discovered this band and that kind of shifted our direction.
Well, I recall that we got into Happy the Man all together at once, around 94, 95, I guess. Right? That had a huge influence on me personally in my listening. And I still love those two Happy the Man studio records. So I think Happy the Man, when we heard that, most listeners should know who they are, but they were an American prog band from the 70s. And they're just phenomenal, just great stuff, great compositions, great attention to detail, great musicianship. And I never felt that we could or should compete with that. Like, we're never going to be that perfect. Our records were never going to be, we still had the garage band in us. We also didn't have Ken Scott, producing our record. We had very limited budgets for everything that we did. So the things we did were never going to be perfect, but Happy the Man was a big influence on us. I know arrangement wise, something like Our Song, The Broken Waltz, which came out on our first EP, just that arrangement, the idea of how you take, it's an odd meter song. You've got a melody. It's kind of stretched out. You've got a kind of dexterous, interesting instrumental part in the middle. And then when you reprise the melody, it's squished together. Does that make sense? So you're tweaking the arrangement as you go. To me, that stuff came from Happy the Man directly. That's who I think of. Yeah, I agree. I would also say that National Health's complete disc set really rang in with me, because I think I feel like I was listening to that in 1994, shortly after we started playing, and we there was sort of a record swapping routine. I think you got me into Hatfield in the North out of National Health. I think most people find National Health the other way, since Hatfield came first. I think, unless I'm mistaken, we found National Health on CD, the 2-disc set, and then you went and sought out some vinyl of the Hatfield records. I'm pretty sure is how that went.
That sounds right. I know that a friend of mine had parts. I think he had a tape copy of the Rodders Club, and he was in a jam band. He was more into Herbie Hancock and that kind of stuff. But so it sort of surprised me to see him listening to this. He seemed to like it, and but I grabbed that and I devoured it. And at that point I was true diehard Health fan and a Happy the Man fan by that point anyway, because I have a recollection of oh, well, this little synth part kind of reminds me of something from a Happy the Man, like a part that I was trying to work out. So yeah, that jives with me. So Happy the Man, Health, and Hatfield were really big, influences that really started to open up the Canterbury world. Happy the Man wouldn't be called Canterbury because they were American, I guess, but they're all stylistically very similar. So, that really opened up a whole other world of listening for all of us. But
if anybody listening is wondering what those things sound like, we do have a Spotify and a YouTube music playlist, and we're going to drop in a lot of these bands, including our band Volaré that we're talking about, because maybe not everybody out there has heard Volaré. Hard to imagine, but maybe we can throw some Volaré stuff in there as well.
I think we'll include a Bandcamp link and some other links, whatever's out there. I highly recommend it. I think it's good stuff. So the Canterbury scene, though, that ended up being a bigger deal. Looking back on it, a bigger deal than I think I really realized, because I would not, while, the progressive rock, the underground progressive rock press, such as it is of the time, used Canterbury as a descriptor for us in almost every review that I read. I would be hard pressed to list a very, very, artists that I guess what I'm saying is I didn't soak in that stuff as much as you might think, given that we were described in that way. But I really got into the stuff that I did get into. And I would say that, of course, the big thing that Health and Hatfield have in common is Dave Stewart, who also played with the Bruford's band and a bunch of others. And I would say that he was like, he in very short order became a huge influence on me. His writing, Alan Gowan as well. He was just, there was something about his solos and use of the Fender Rhodes that I just like, oh man.
I bet we could list on one hand, 5 fingers, maybe a couple of toes in addition, but 5 or 6 fingers, the Canterbury albums that we were into while we were in our band together.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember Steve brought in Opportunity Box.
Yeah.
And we listened to that. And you had the first 2 Hatfields. We had the first 2 National Health records that we liked. That's almost Fish Rising, Steve Hillage.
Yes.
You had that.
Yes.
Right?
Loved that.
Besides those 6, we didn't really get into Soft Machine. I still don't really love Soft Machine that much. I like what I like by them, but I don't like everything by them. And Caravan I got into later in life. I don't think that we really did. Can you think of any other Canterbury? Gilgamesh we had, but I don't know that it was, we enjoyed it, but I wouldn't necessarily say that first Gilgamesh record was a big influence on the music we made together.
Yeah, I was listening back to Another Fine Tune just today.
The second Gilgamesh record.
The second one. And I was like, okay, I can hear some actually a few specific things. I was like, okay, I think I copped that somewhere. I wrote something that it's not the faintest line of connection. It's like, oh, Pat might have been listening to that when he came up with this part. Although at the time, I'm not sure I would have listed them as a huge influence. National Health was definitely more of the thing that, like, I just listened to that I listened to the first 2 records constantly for 2 or 3 years. Just, it was in my car and I was just listening to it constantly. A couple other ones that I definitely was influenced by were Con, Space Shanty.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
With Steve Hillage, and I think
Dave Stewart too.
Dave Stewart, but like, was it Clive Brooks playing?
It was, because it was the guys from Egg.
Right. Oh, yeah, right. So,
Egg. You really liked Egg, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I loved Con and I loved Egg. Primarily, the main one I got into was Civil Surface. The other 2 I didn't. In fact, I don't think I even realized there was a third one. I knew I think there's a there's the Polite Force, the Civil Surface, and there's a third one, and I can't remember.
I think there's a self-titled debut. Is that there? Was that the first one?
Yeah. Polite Force was the one that I only listened to for the first time recently. It's a lot more psychedelic, which I really like now. At the time, I don't think I would have gotten into it. It was a little too proto-prog almost.
Yeah, I never fully appreciated Egg, and just recently I got the CD compilation of theirs called the Metronomical Society. I think that's what it's called. Of like, I guess it's radio shows and bootlegs and demos and stuff, and it's more loose, which I like. And I think what put me off from Egg, because I was never a huge fan, even though I loved the organ work, was there was not a looseness in the playing or in the arrangements that you're missing some of that kind of whimsical Canterbury feel you get from the other records. And so when we're talking about being young and playing music together, I was less of a Carl Palmer type drummer and more of a Pip Pile type drummer. And with Egg, there's still that kind of like proggy power trio kind of feel, time feel to the music. It never totally grabbed me.
Yeah. I
still try every now and then. I still have them. I think I've got 2 out of the 3 on vinyl, and I've got that new CD compilation. So every now and then I dig them out, and I think, oh, maybe I'll love it this time. I haven't yet, but I still dig them out every once in a while.
Well, tracks 1 and 3 of the Civil Surface loved those. One was called Enneagram, and the first one I can't place the name of the other one. But yeah, that was those were huge impacts on me from the Canterbury scene. I had other things sort of pushing me in what would turn out to be a very different direction. That would be more jazz type stuff, Pat Metheny group in particular. And so sort of that almost not new age, but it was fusion, but it was also like a little, I don't know, almost like pop music, like a lot of or Weather Channel music, soft.
Well, we
soft
like the
jazz.
ECM too. We like the ECM sound as well.
Yeah. So that was, and he has that heritage, obviously, the first few records with Lyle Mays, and So the Canterbury stuff ended up being such a big deal, though, that there was a sticker on the CD on the Uncertainty Principle
right.
When it was released. It said something along the lines of, if you are a fan of Hatfield in the North, National Health, and Happy the Man, then you will like this Canterbury-inspired record by this, etc. And
I think that could be true. I think there's also in the mix of what we were doing a healthy dose of King Crimson. Distorted guitars and dissonance, and maybe that went against the grain a little bit as far as trying to pigeonhole our band as just a Canterbury rehash band. And that label didn't do us any good at all, because we're playing. I think people now think, oh, you're in a prog band, so you're playing Prog Fest or whatever. That stuff hadn't trickled down to us yet. We ended up playing 1, 2 progressive rock kind of events ever. But I mean, we were a club band. We had to hold our own night after night in these, beer-soaked college town dive bars. It doesn't do you any good to throw around, oh yeah, Steve Hillage, Fish Rising is not going to get you in at the door at these clubs, because nobody knows these bands and nobody cares. Right.
Right. Well, and another thing that did kind of occur to me is that, like, so the, Canterbury music aside, like our heroes were very different. It's not just like, oh, well, we're inspired by these bands and so we sound like them. It's more like, well, we liked bands that were kind of predicated on virtuosity on their instrument, so Pat Metheny was a class act guitar player, but and that's fine. And so we were into that kind of a thing. And I don't think these bands, the things that inspired them was not virtuosity. It was a different thing. It was like a, and that's not a put down at all. It's not meant to be. It's sort of like they were going for a different thing. It wasn't, I'm not sure the right way to describe it, but it was, a completely different ethos.
They set out, they had their own aesthetic and they nailed it, and people loved it, and it's great. But right. I hope to never hear it again.
I hope they're doing very well. Right. I'm sure they would make a nice neighbor and would borrow a cup of milk.
But regarding the virtuosity, which is true, I mean, as progressive rock fans, when we listen to the Yes album or Foxtrot or whatever, those records, you hear the virtuosity in the musicianship, and it's stellar, and it brings you back. And there's a reason why I've listened to those records, no lie, thousands of times over the years. Thousands. Love them, right? It brings you back. But if we go backward in our little time machine back to 1994, 95, the four of us or five of us, we were not virtuosos. And I think that's why you get the essence of us really bursting forth as a band together, because we had more enthusiasm than virtuosity. We had bigger dreams than what we could actually accomplish as far as what we did on our instruments. And we rehearsed like crazy. I mean, we just played all the time, and we just worked on music all the time. But if you had pulled me out of the band and said, hey, go sit in with these cats over there, I would have totally flunked it and sounded terrible, right? We were not virtuosos, but that's what makes it work, because we were striving within our constraints, and it was pedal to the metal. See, another car analogy there for you. Pedal to the metal, and that's what made it work. And it's kind of like, maybe like, we all love the sound of the Mellotron from back in the day, but it doesn't really sound like an orchestra, right? It sounds like a Mellotron. It sounds like somebody has recorded stuff on tapes, and then some dude is playing the tapes with his fingers in the studio.
Right.
It's not an orchestra, right? And it sounds like its own thing. So we were not virtuosos. We were doing everything we could, just popping out of our own skin to try to achieve whatever we could, grab whatever we could in that 2 or 3 year span. And I think that's what makes it so lively and exciting, even now when I listen back to it. I think, oh yeah, we did a good job.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I think that, I do think that maybe I will personally give us a little more credit as far as proficiency on our respective instruments is concerned, simply because I think that we learned a lot. And while none of us, at least at the time, would have been suitable for being studio cats, some kind of hotshot session cat type of guy, like you were saying, go play with these dudes, and we're none of us were going to go get the gig with Steely Dan or something like that. But but because of the type of music we were playing, I thought it was incredibly ambitious. The more I think about it, it's like, man, that stuff was hard to play, so it did require some proficiency.
Certainly, yeah.
So, but to your point, I don't think the idea was to be like 64th notes all day, Dream Theater or some kind of shredder type of stuff. No offense to Dream Theater, but you see what I'm saying? It's like that was sort of the thing, but the ambition and the enthusiasm was definitely there in spades. And I think it served us well, because it brought us all along, though. It brought us through the whole thing, and we learned a lot. I think we were, by the time it was all over, because we were playing so frequently and writing, we were writing a lot in those. We wrote a lot of stuff in that short period of time. So by the time we stopped, we were really tight and really good. We were really good. And there's always the woulda, coulda, shoulda of, what would have happened, but it's we left it in a good place, I'd say.
Yes. And to echo your points, if I hear some of those soundboard tapes from our nightclub gigs, our rock club gigs in '96 especially, it was a pretty smoking band. I mean, really it was good.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Underdubs. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. See you next time.